Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. My name is Priscilla Solis and I'm going to be teaching you about painting over the course of the next few weeks with Inspiration Fine Arts. Thank you for tuning in for your first episode or lesson with Inspiration Fine Arts. Today's lesson is going to be about acrylic paints. I'm going to be breaking down my lessons based on paint type, and so as we go on, we're going to cover different mediums. And before we dive into all that though, I wanted to preface this with some of my experience. I am a rising senior at Carnegie Vanguard High School. I have worked with theater department in my high school as technical director and scenic charge whenever needed for any shows. And if you don't know what those things are, the technical director in the theater is basically the person that leads all the construction that goes on to put the set on stage. And so they deal with the wood, they deal with the power tools, things of that nature. Fun. And the scenic charge is someone that handles all of the painting and making all the things they build look pretty. And I have had the blessing of being able to work in both of those positions, and so I understand what kind of designing and process goes into both of those positions. And I wanted to be able to give opportunity to other people to hone their artist eye as well, and just have an outlet, because painting and drawing and sculpting have definitely been outlets for me all of my life, and I want to be able to provide that for other people. And so with that, let's get into the lesson. Alrighty, let's get into it. So let me start with some of the materials I'm going to be using today. I'm going to be using just some water in a cup, a rag to dry off my brushes after I wash them in this simple solution. This is really just a little bit of dish soap and some water. If you have paintbrush conditioner or paintbrush cleaner, you can feel free to use that, but this has been a very trusty alternative for me in my painting days. I'm going to be using these three basic colors, just red, yellow, and blue. This is, if you want to follow along with the actual colors, I'm going to be using cadmium red, deep hue, cadmium yellow, deep hue, and cerulean blue hue. And over here I'm going to be having the little key of which technique corresponds with whatever number. I'm going to be putting the numbers down here and showing you the technique on this mixed media paper. And this mixed media paper is not a requirement, although it is definitely helpful because the paper is built to hold this kind of paint. And so I feel that having mixed media paper lying around will just be beneficial as an artist, because as an artist, we're definitely always playing around with different sorts of media. So yeah, but you can use any sort of cardstock or just thick paper in general. Sometimes I even use index cards to create little paintings of my own. It's really up to you, really up to what you have at your disposal. So feel free to use any sort of thick paper, really. Then I'm going to be using any sort of brush. You can use any sort of brush because this is a techniques video. Again, it's not going to be very specific. Flat brushes. Flat brushes are best for geometric shapes, lines, edges, really what you have to do. This is actually my favorite brush because it's very versatile. And then we have a round brush. Round brushes are best used for curves, any sort of flowy texture you want. Yeah, that's about it. And then you're going to be needing a paint knife of any sort. If you don't have a paint knife, you can really use any sort of piece of plastic, like an ID card or a bus card or anything. So yeah, it's a good alternative. I've definitely used that before. I have no shame. So yeah. So let's start with the dry brush technique. So the dry brush technique, it really depends on how much paint you put on the brush, because if you put a little bit of paint, the more see-through the paint strokes are going to be. Let me mark this down. Oh, I'm at it. So one's going to correspond with dry brush over here. So if you put more paint on your brush, the brush strokes are going to be less see-through. So I'm just going to put a little bit of paint on my brush here. And you can see that it's more translucent. And I'm going to put more paint on my brush just to show you how less translucent it is. So yeah, that's just dry brushing. It's a dry brush into the paint. that's really all there is to it. I'll be cleaning off my brush in this solution here. And also, this is a quick little helpful tip. You never want to leave a paintbrush in water for too long because it can actually destroy the wood that is holding the bristles. So, and then this can come off, and it's gonna make it so that you can't use it anymore. So you don't want to do that. You never want to leave paintbrushes in water for too long, longer than you need them to be. So for the second technique, we're gonna do a wet brush, which is also known as a wash, but it's not the same as the washing that we're going to be talking about here. So I'm going to use a little bit of blue for this. So what you're going to do is you're going to wet your brush, like it says. So I'm going to go into the clean water here because I don't want soap to mix with the paint. You really don't want a lot of water. It depends on how much water you add as well. So you're just going to dip that in that. And then you get a wash. It really has like a watercolor effect, and so you'll definitely see this texture come up again when we go over watercolors. And so that is using a wet brush. Next, we're gonna be using wet on wet technique. So wet on wet is when let me open up the yellow because I might use a little bit of yellow. So wet on wet is actually, you use a wet brush. You're going to take a little bit of wet paint. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to write down the number. And you're going to lay down a little bit of that wet paint. Then you're going to clean off that paint. And you're going to dry your brush. Wet it in the clean water because again you don't want the soap mixing with the paint. Then you're gonna take a little bit of paint again, and then this is the wet on wet technique. If you don't want to lay down a base color, and if you just want kind of a wash, again you're just gonna lay down water instead of paint mixed with water as the base. And then you're gonna take some more water, a little bit more paint, and you can see how it creates that texture. So the next technique we're going to be talking about is washing. So with washing, let me use a different brush for this. You're going to start off with a dry brush. You're going to take a bit of paint. Again, I need to write the number down. This is the washing, by the way. Again, you're gonna just lay down some dry brushing. Then you wash off that brush because you don't want, again, I always wash my brushes as soon as possible whenever I can because I don't want any sort of paint damaging the bristles. And that's usually what happens when you let it dry. Then next, you're going to wait for that to dry a little bit. Then, this is not all concrete as well. You can definitely do a wash while this paint is still wet, but I feel for teaching's sake, it would be a little bit better to wait for it to dry. So now that it's a little bit dry, I'm going to take a wet brush, dip it into the paint, and then create a wash. So you see that? How it just overlays the color like that, but it still keeps the original paint. So next, we're going to be talking about impasto. So impasto, you're going to be needing a paint knife. Write down the number. This is actually one of my favorites. You're just going to be taking just a little bit of paint on your paint knife. Then you're gonna just create textures with it. You just kind of lay it down. You can even it out and create a flat texture, or you can scratch it up. It's really up to you. So yeah. So that's Impasto. Righty. So next technique is going to be scratching. And so scratching, you're going to need a dry brush base. So you're just going to lay down some color. And while it's still wet, you're going to take your painting knife and just scratch at it to create texture. So I'm going to take some of this blue here. Okay. Then I'm going to lay it down. Just simple flat. Then next, while it's still wet, I'm gonna take this painting knife and scratch at it. You can even use, if you don't have a painting knife, you can even use the back of your paintbrush. So next technique is going to be dripping. So with dripping, it's really just a wash, and then you're just going to let it drip down the paper. So you're going to go in with a, you know what, I'm going to use a round brush for this because I feel a round brush would be better for this technique. You're going to go in with the wet brush, take some color, wet brush, take some color. You're gonna want, oh sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't go in with the clean water first. I think that's the reason this isn't holding on to the bristles. One moment. Let me clean this brush. Go in with the clean water. And then picking up some of the color, but I don't want to overpower the water. So then you're just gonna hold your page at an angle and squeeze your brush so that a drop comes out, and you're gonna let that drip. If you lay it back down, it's just gonna create a regular wash. If you wanna keep it to be a drip, you're just gonna take all of the color and put it down like that. And for the next one, splattering, splatters, very similar. You're just gonna go in with a very wet brush and splatter the page. So go in with the clean water, and you're going to pick a little bit of color up, but not too much because you don't want to overpower the water. And then you're just gonna that didn't really work out the first time. It's fine. Sometimes things don't work out. Maybe go in with a bit more water to make it a bit more watery, and then it could splatter more easily. I'm trying to keep this contained because I don't want it to... There you go. It got into the other techniques, but you get the idea. So next is stamping. Stamping, another one of my favorites. You're gonna lay down, I'm gonna need a little bit more paint. You're gonna lay down a flat base, or sometimes you don't even need a base for this one. Sometimes you can just stamp with, I'll show both, I'll demonstrate both. So you're going with a dry brush, create a flat base. And while it's still wet, a lot of these techniques, you like the ones that have to deal with a base, you most likely want to do it while it's still wet. Unless you're doing a wash, of course, and you want to make for it to be a little bit dry. But then again, you can also do that while it's still wet. It's your choice. Okay, lay down a flat base. Then you're going to take something like an index card crumble it up. And then you're going to dip this, or any side of this, in another color. And you're going to create kind of a two-toned effect. So a little bit of color, dip it, dip it, and then you're just gonna stamp it. And then this also works if you don't have a base. Like, you can just do it on regular old paper and it still looks good. You can use a sponge to do stamping. You can use basically anything with a texture. You can even use the bottom of a cup. Like my dad, who is an abstract painter, he would sometimes paint the bottom of a cup and just stamp his paintings. I don't know, maybe in future lessons I'll show some of his paintings because I have some in my room. I'm very proud of his work. So the next technique is scumbling. Scumbling, we did this a lot in the theater. And what you're going to do is, it's basically a dry brush. I've never tried a scumble with a wet brush. Maybe one of you can try and send me videos of it, see how it goes. Might just discover a whole new technique. But you're going to take, actually I just put down more blue, but I just figured that I want to do red and yellow. For a scumble, whenever I give my lesson on colors and things of that nature, for a scumble you're going to want to have colors that create a harmony. And I'll get more into that later. But for now, so it's best to do this with a round brush actually, because what you're going to be doing is stamping with your brush, if that makes sense. Just doing this motion with the brush. So you're going to take a bit of one color, lay it down, just lay it down a little bit. Then this is up to you if you want to clean your brush or not. I prefer cleaning my brush because I see that it creates more of a contrast between the colors, and I don't want to overmix the colors. That's very important in scumbling, that you don't want to mix the colors too much to where it just creates one color. So I'm going to take a bit of the second color and just lay it down like that, to where it just creates, you don't want to over scumble. You don't want to create one color. You want to keep the two colors different, but not too different. So yeah, like that. Okay, next on the list is masking. And masking, you're actually going to need a sharp edge or masking tape if you have it, but I'm just going to be using a piece of index card. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a dry brush. You can also use a wet brush for this one. You're going to take a dry brush, lay down a mask of some sort that's covering the base, and you're just going to lay down a color. On top of that. And then when you lift it up, or whenever you take off the masking tape, it should create a sharp edge. That does tend to happen because I'm not using tape. But then again, you can also create something new with it. This is also something called soft edge, where you just create an edge with your brush as opposed to something like a piece of paper. Like, this is a hard edge right here and this is a soft edge. So next on the list is stippling. Stippling is like scumbling, but you're using the same pat 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 technique, but with one color, because if you use two colors or more, it becomes scumbling. Not unless one of the colors is dried, of course. So you're gonna take a round brush, a little bit of a color, and just pat, 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 pat. And so people mainly use this technique when putting leaves on a tree, other things of that sort. And then the last one, my favorite, is actually something I'd never found really a word for, like an actual name for. So it's just called stacking because you just stack colors. And so this is when you put a little bit of paint directly from the tube onto the paper in a little dollop like that. And this one we want to kind of be careful because you don't want to get another paint in another paint tube. So you just put them next to each other like that, like you're stacking the colors. And you're just going to take a paint knife or an edge of some sort and stack the colors. You can also do this with a paintbrush. There's an artist on Instagram that I recommend some of you to follow. It's DHTON, and he does a lot of this. He has his technique. This is basically his brand, is using this technique. Not this one, but with a brush, stacking with a brush. So you're going to do the same thing, same setup. Paint dollops right next to each other. And you're going to take a brush. Actually, let me find a brush big enough for this. One moment. You're going to take a brush. I grabbed a much bigger brush. You're going to take a brush and you're going to keep it in a straight line at first because you don't want to mix the colors. But once you get a little bit in with a straight line, you're going to just start. You can start making curves or you can keep going. It's really up to you. Like that. And you see, as you go on, they nicely mix together. And so that is all for our lesson today. And thank you for tuning into the painting course. Again, my name is Priscilla Solis. Future lessons will include more on different types of paint, colors, things of that nature. And you can check out more Inspiration Fine Arts videos at our YouTube channel. We are a nonprofit that ties bring arts to at-risk youth. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link below. Subscribe and like to stay notified of future videos and to help us out. Have a great and safe day.
Hi, we are your IFA co-founders. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Miriam.
And thank you so much for watching our videos.
You guys can learn more about our cause down below at our website, www.inspirationfinearts.org.
And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We couldn't be where we are without the support of you guys, so make sure to send in videos of the things that you've learned during classes and pictures of the art that you completed.
Everything you send in will be featured on all our social media platforms.
Thanks for supporting us, and until next time,
Go find your inspiration.